Hello and welcome. I see that with Zoom, the audience is joining and coming in as we speak, so that's wonderful. I'll just give that half a second before we really get going in our presentation today. It looks like we're kind of getting the good group in, so I'll just keep it moving so we can stay on our time frame that we've allocated today. And thank you so much for taking the time to join with us. So welcome officially. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you may be joining with us today. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the team lead of with the Work Wellness Institute. And I would like to again welcome you to our webinar today on building workplaces where neurodivergent workers thrive. I would like to begin by starting with an acknowledgement that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We would like to thank our academic team and our 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent project. Harnessing Talent Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC, as well as, of course, our memberships to the Work Wellness Institute. And of course, we would like to thank our advisory committee and our speakers, who, without their contributions, this webinar series is not possible. So thank you so much to all of our speakers, and particularly our speaker today, for contributing to this series. I'll just go through a few technical housekeeping points before we get started. So hopefully at this point you've been hearing the introduction so far, whether that's through your computer speakers or if you've chosen to dial in. You should also be able to see the title slide on the screen. And I'll take a note now that there is the closed captioning function. So if you look to the bottom of your screen, it's most likely at the bottom of your screen, a toolbar, and you'll see CC, and there you go to click on that, and then you'll have the option for closed captions if that's of a requirement for you today. In terms of being able to communicate with us, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you'd like to share your thoughts, you have questions, all of that good stuff, there are 2 ways to communicate with us in today's webinar. So again, I'll just bring your attention to that toolbar. Again, most likely at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function as well as a question and answer function. So if you are experiencing any issues from a tech perspective, or you'd like to put something out to the group, a thought, a comment, anything like that, please feel free to use the chat function, as well as we will be supplying an FAQ sheet into the chat that's helpful in terms of any maybe minor technical questions or usage of Zoom or anything like that. We also have a dedicated question and answer period held at the end of this webinar presentation. So as you're going through the presentation, you're thinking of questions, please utilize that secondary function that's specifically Q&A at the bottom in the menu bar as well. And if you can send your questions through there, that way we can just help navigate the question and answer a little bit easier at the end of today's session. And this function, just so it is known to the group, this function does allow you to send through questions using the Q&A anonymously and privately. So if that's helpful to you in sending through your questions, the Q&A offers you those options, whereas the chat does go through to the full group. All right, if a couple questions are coming to your mind about what happens after this webinar today, I'll just address those quickly now. There will be an email and post communication sent to all attendees after the session, and that will include the recording link. So the presentation today is recorded, as well as any presentation materials. If we do run out of time for an abundance of questions, we do also try to include any answers that may not have gotten to, if that does occur today. And again, this presentation is recorded, so you will receive it post communications, but you can always find it available to the public on our eCampus and our website through the workwellnessinstitute.org. A quick reminder to our Work Wellness Institute members that you will receive automatic free certificates of attendance by attending today's webinar. Thank you so much for indulging those housekeeping notes. And I'm pleased to move into the main event today and introduce our speaker, Dr. Jane Hutchison, who has very graciously provided her time and expertise for us today. Jane is a senior research associate at the Conference Board of Canada. As a member of the Education and Skills team, Jane conducts mixed methods research on topics related to education, skills, needs, and training, and workplace inclusion. She is currently leading a research project on how employers can better support the employment and career trajectories of neurodivergent Canadians. Jane holds a PhD in psychology and a master's in public policy from Georgetown University. And again, we're so thrilled to have you with us today. I'm very happy to pass things over to you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for taking the time to attend this session and learn a little bit more about how to build workplaces where neurodivergent workers thrive. As Elizabeth just mentioned, I am a senior research associate on the Education and Skills team at the Conference Board of Canada. And for the past year or so, I've been leading a mixed methods research study to better understand how we can support neurodivergent workers in Canadian workplaces. In my presentation today, I will begin by providing some background information on what neurodiversity is. I will then briefly discuss our study aims and methodological approach. I will then review some of our key findings and offer some recommendations for how workplaces can implement more neuro-inclusive practices into the workplace. Before I start, I did just want to take off my researcher cap for a moment and share a little bit about myself and my own personal journey with neurodiversity. So I essentially completed all of my schooling up until the end of my PhD with what I didn't know was undiagnosed ADHD. In the third year of my PhD program, so around 4 years ago, is when I really started to become aware of my ADHD symptoms. This was a point in my graduate studies where I was done with classes. And so my work became much more unstructured and self-directed. And that can be very challenging for someone who struggles with attention and organization and no longer has that kind of set deadline schedule and positive reinforcement cycle. So that is when I really started to become aware of some of these attention difficulties that I was experiencing. Although I did, in true ADHD fashion, ignore these symptoms for many years and just try to power through. I thought this is just, who I am as a person. I'm a little bit clumsy and disorganized, but, whatever. It is only when I started working on this project and I realized that I was relating a lot to many of the individuals with ADHD that I spoke with. So it was just kind of, slapping me in the face every day. And I realized that I had to get a handle on my own ADHD symptoms in order to, improve my experiences and confidence and motivation in the workplace. So it's only really within the past few months that I have received a diagnosis for ADHD and started treatment for ADHD. And the reason I wanted to share this is because it's very, very common for ADHD and other forms of neurodivergence, such as autism, to go undiagnosed, especially within women. I believe the average age for an ADHD diagnosis in women is between 30 and 40 years old. So I myself didn't realize that I had ADHD until the age of 29. I hear very frequently that many women don't realize that they have ADHD or autism until they're going through the process of trying to get their child diagnosed, because there is a big genetic component as well. I think this just goes to show that ADHD and other forms of neurodivergence are quite misunderstood. And there are many individuals who go through life without even realizing that they are neurodivergent. And so especially in the workplace, So with all that being said, I will now put my researcher cap back on and talk to you a little bit more about what neurodiversity is and how we can better support it in the workplace. So our research team for this project, I'm not the only one working on this project. So it's made up of myself. As I mentioned, I'm a senior research associate on the Education and Skills team. We also have Lindsay Coffin, who is the associate director of the human capital team at the Conference Board, and Erin Mills, who is the director of human capital and inclusion at the Conference Board. So this has been a really exciting project that spans multiple knowledge areas. And I think it's great to have that kind of interdisciplinary lens for this project. I do also want to acknowledge how this work was funded. So this research is funded by the Future Skills Center Future Skills Center, sorry. So if you're not already familiar, this is a consortium made up of 3 partners, Blueprint in Toronto, Toronto Metropolitan University, and the Conference Board. And together, the 3 partners work together to research, develop tools, and mobilize knowledge on a variety of topics related to the future of work and skills. The Future Skills Center is funded by the Government of Canada through Employment and Social Development Canada, so ESDC, that Elizabeth mentioned earlier as well. Okay, so before I get into the meat of the presentation, I did want to begin with a quick poll just to gauge how familiar everyone is with the concept of neurodiversity. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a huge lack of awareness. I myself hadn't even heard the term neurodiversity until a year ago when I started this project, and I do identify as a neurodivergent individual. So this is really just a quick pulse check to see where everyone stands on their knowledge of neurodiversity.
The results are being shared. I can read them out as well if that's helpful.
Great. No, I can see them there. So
perfect.
The majority of people somewhat familiar, which makes sense. Not very many are, very familiar, and kind of a big chunk there of not at all familiar. I will also say that people attending this session today, might have been driven to attend because of their interest in the topic. If we were to poll, just the general population, I would expect kind of that not at all familiar option to be more popular. But it's great to see that people have some understanding of neurodiversity, and I hope that I can, advance your knowledge a little bit today, and by sharing a little bit more about best practices for supporting neurodivergent workers. Okay, so what even is neurodiversity? So for those of you who responded not at all familiar, neurodiversity really just conveys the idea that there are simply natural variations amongst humans that lead to differences in terms of how people think, process information, and interact with others. There are many different conditions that fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, including autism spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, as well as certain mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and OCD. It's important to remember that neurodiversity is really not something that needs to be fixed. Our focus shouldn't be on, training neurodivergent workers to blend into existing workplace processes and cultures, but really it's about better understanding neurodiversity and how it can be better accommodated when needed in the workplace. Neurodivergent individuals have demonstrated significant potential in the workplace. In fact, many neurodivergent workers tend to perform above average in areas such as creativity, resilience, pattern recognition, memory, and mathematics. So skills that are all conducive to success in the workplace. It is important to note that I am speaking in general terms here. Neurodiversity, of course, encompasses many different types of people with differing strengths. These are just a few areas in which, according to research, many neurodivergent individuals do tend to excel. It's also important to recognize that companies that have embraced neurodiversity, there aren't many that have started to implement these neurodiversity inclusion programs, but those who have seen many benefits in terms of improved productivity, innovation, and company morale. So one of the main takeaway messages that I want people to leave with today is that incorporating more supports for neurodiversity into the workplace is not only beneficial for the neurodivergent worker, but it can have large benefits for the company as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit more about these benefits a little bit later in the presentation. For now, though, I do want to highlight that despite the potential for neurodivergent individuals to be highly valuable employees, they continue to face barriers to employment and career progression. So there aren't very many statistics on this, but as one example, the most recent Canadian survey on disability found that only 33% of working age adults on the autism spectrum reported being employed in 2017. And in one of the few surveys of working age Canadian adults with ADHD, the Center for ADHD Awareness found that 32% of respondents reported an inability to keep a job, 50% reported difficulties in being promoted, and 70% reported financial difficulties more generally. So this just goes to show that despite their many talents, neurodivergent individuals are currently underutilized in the workforce. With many Canadian companies currently experiencing significant labor shortages, which I'm sure you've heard about in the news and in the media, Employers can benefit from implementing practices and policies that are aimed at recruiting and retaining talent from underrepresented groups, such as those who are neurodivergent. So to better understand how workplaces can become more inclusive and attractive to those who are neurodivergent, we designed a mixed methods research study to explore best practices and strategies for strengthening workplace engagement amongst neurodivergent Canadians. Through this study, we aim to raise awareness about the benefits and challenges of neurodiversity in the workplace, while also providing recommendations to employers in terms of how best to recruit, retain, and support neurodivergent talent. Whoops, sorry. I somehow went back many slides. Okay, so we asked the following research questions. 1, what barriers do neurodivergent employees face? 2, what supports and opportunities currently exist for neurodivergent employees? And 3, what steps can employers take to better support neurodivergent employees in the workplace? All of our research projects at the Conference Board do have a research advisory board that is made up of experts on the topic to provide guidance and feedback. So our research advisory board includes David Maloney, who identifies as autistic and is a mutual fund indexer at CIBC. He is also a board member at Autism Ontario. Radha McCullough is the VP and head of Canada for Specialty Sterna North America. If you're not familiar, Specialty Sterna is a nonprofit organization that helps businesses recruit, retain, and support neurodivergent employees. Leona Faulkner is the co-founder of Neuro Inclusion Works, a nonprofit organization focused on improving the workplace experience for neurodivergent Canadians. Dr. Meg Gibson is a professor of social development studies and social work at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. She is currently leading a research project called Neurodiversity Matters, which explores what different people think about neurodiversity. And then finally, Minu Sakand was previously the executive lead for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Holland Bloorview, and is currently the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Ontario government. She is also the founder and CEO of the nonprofit organization Accessibility for All. Our RAB members have been involved in helping us develop our research plan and materials, and have also provided very helpful feedback on research outputs. So very quickly, I'll go over our methodology for this project, which consisted of an online survey, which was completed by 171 neurodivergent employees or job seekers and 139 managers, 54 of whom also identified as neurodivergent. The survey was designed to better understand perspectives, attitudes, and ideas for supporting neurodiversity in the workplace. Key findings from this survey were highlighted in a recently published issue briefing that if either Elizabeth or Emma has an opportunity to, I believe that they could share the link to that either following this presentation or in the chat. To build on our survey findings, we then conducted 40 semi-structured interviews with neurodivergent Canadian workers, as well as employers who have experience hiring and managing those who are neurodivergent. Insights from these interviews allowed us to build on the survey findings and provide more actionable recommendations to employers in terms of building neuro-inclusive workplaces. We do have a longer report and executive summary coming out that goes into more detail than the issue briefing does that I just mentioned. So I'll be sure to try to get that into your hands once it is published. It will essentially go into more detail on the findings and recommendations that I'm going to provide in this presentation today. Okay, so now let's get into the interesting part. So the key findings. So I'm going to break up my discussion of our key findings into 3 sections. First, I will discuss 5 barriers to employment and career progression that were identified by neurodivergent workers and employers of neurodivergent workers. I will then share some employer perspectives on the benefits of a neurodiverse workplace, and I will conclude by providing recommendations for how to build workplaces where neurodivergent workers thrive. When going over the key findings, I'm going to refer to our survey data as well as qualitative insights from our participant interviews. Okay, so before we can talk about how to improve the workplace experience for neurodivergent individuals, we have to first be aware of the barriers that they face. We heard in our research that the #1 barrier to employment and career progression for neurodivergent workers is a lack of awareness and understanding about what neurodiversity is, as well as associated stigma and bias. So I had mentioned earlier that I myself only recently became aware of the concept of neurodiversity, and this is the case for many people. We found that more than half of our sample, including those who identify as neurodivergent, had only become aware of the term within the past 5 years. So it is a relatively new concept, especially when thinking about it in the workplace. Further, the vast majority of our interview participants cited a lack of awareness and understanding as the most important workplace issue that neurodivergent individuals currently face. This limited awareness and understanding poses a significant barrier to neurodivergent employees, as it allows unexamined biases about neurodiversity to persist. So, for example, one of the neurodivergent workers that we interviewed stated, "I think that people's lack of understanding of what neurodiversity is leads to their formulation of assumptions, which means that they will automatically write you off from something rather than looking at the opportunity and thinking about ways that that opportunity can be modified." To demonstrate what this interview participant is saying, we can think about the perceived importance of eye contact in professional communications. So many neurodivergent individuals, not all, but many, particularly those on the autism spectrum, prefer not to make eye contact while conversing with others. This does not mean that they are not interested or engaged in the conversation. It's simply just a natural reaction that occurs in some social situations. However, during an interview, an employer who has limited understanding of what neurodiversity is and what it may look like in an interview may perceive that lack of eye contact to be unprofessional or demonstrate a lack of confidence or engagement, and ultimately bypass a highly qualified candidate because of their own internal biases of how people should be, behaving or appearing in an interview. Another common barrier is a lack of support in a daunting and/or rigid process for accessing accommodations. According to our survey, we found that while over 90% of our respondents agreed that neurodivergent employees should be provided with accommodations when needed, we also found that very few currently are. So only 22% of neurodivergent employees in their organization are stated that they are provided with any tools, training, or supports to better assist them in their day-to-day activities and/or communications with managers and coworkers. Additionally, when asked about accommodations, one of our interview participants stated they work, but the employee has to seek them out and know that they are there. There is not enough advertisement within the organization, so some do without. And I think this quote highlights a pertinent issue that came up frequently in our research, which is that the onus of seeking accommodations typically does fall on the individual rather than on the organization. And we heard from neurodivergent workers that they are sometimes reluctant to seek out accommodations for a few reasons. For one, the accommodation process in many workplaces can be very bureaucratic, with lots of paperwork and hoops to jump through and medical notes to track down. So many neurodivergent individuals just find it too overwhelming to engage in this type of process. Placing the onus of seeking accommodations on the individual might also make people feel as though they have to disclose their neurodiversity status, which then brings me to the next barrier that I want to talk about, which is the fear of disclosure. So we found that 50% of neurodivergent employees surveyed felt that informing their employers about neurodiversity or about their own neurodiversity status might limit their opportunities for career progression or have other negative repercussions, such as being viewed differently in the workplace. Issues surrounding disclosure also came up in our interviews. So for example, one neurodivergent worker said, neurodivergent workers don't want to disclose because it puts them in a vulnerable position. And I can speak from my own experience as well, that in disclosing things, it's been weaponized against me and used to not allow me the same opportunities as other people in the workplace. So together, these findings suggest that many neurodivergent employees don't feel comfortable sharing their neurodiversity status with their employer. And while it is a personal decision whether one wants to disclose or not, neurodivergent workers do deserve a workplace environment in which they feel comfortable with whatever choice they choose to make regarding disclosure. Another common barrier is unclear or ambiguous communication in the workplace. So as an example, when asked about difficulties in the workplace, this participant stated, the first word that comes to mind is communication, miscommunication, misunderstanding on different points of reference. The challenge is speaking from another point of view than what is common. So as an example of this that came up frequently is when managers provide vague or inconsistent feedback or are not clear about their expectations. Neurodivergent workers find this particularly challenging to try to just figure out what is expected of them rather than just being explicitly told. This can be quite frustrating and can lead to misunderstandings and miscommunications. Many neurodivergent individuals can also have very literal communication styles. And for this reason, we heard in our research that it's best to avoid common workplace phrases or idioms such as take the bull by the horns or go by the book, hands are tied, learn the ropes. These can all be confusing and frustrating to those who are neurodivergent, and the overall recommendation is that they should be avoided when possible. So overall, communication in the workplace should be clear, direct, and free of ambiguity, sarcasm, and colloquialisms. I always struggle with that word. Okay, and then the fifth barrier and final barrier that I'm going to talk about today relates to social norms and masking. So masking, if you're not familiar with the term, occurs when a neurodivergent individual feels that they must suppress their natural behaviors and tendencies to fit in with what is expected in the traditional workplace. So for example, one participant stated, I think there is inherent value in having a very specific type of interaction and a very specific type of relationship within the workplace. And it puts neurodivergent individuals in a position of having to grin and bear it and adapt and mask, which can be incredibly draining for a lot of people. So if you think about all of the, cognitive effort that goes into trying to appear a certain way and fighting against your natural, tendencies, you can imagine that that can be very tiring and exhausting and can easily lead to burnout in the workplace. Given the limited understanding and acceptance of neurodivergent communication styles and behaviors, many neurodivergent individuals express to us in our research that they feel that they have no choice currently but to mask in the workplace. So before I get into some recommendations for how employers can begin to break down these barriers, I do want to highlight some employer perspectives on why it's advantageous to do so. So we know from our own research, as well as prior research, that there are many benefits associated with a neurodiverse workforce. Employers who have already implemented neurodiversity inclusion initiatives have overwhelmingly positive feedback to share, citing improved company culture and morale, more diverse perspectives, increased retention, better managers, and above average talent and skills as some of the benefits that they've experienced. So I'll discuss each of these benefits in turn before turning over to our recommendations for employers. So to begin, the majority of employers that were interviewed stated that by providing more supports for neurodiversity in the workplace, their companies have seen a huge boost to company culture and morale. We heard that by incorporating more awareness training for neurodiversity in the workplace, coworkers and managers become more accepting of differences in personality, communication, and working styles, and come to understand that these differences can be an asset that should be celebrated. So for example, one employer said, we've also found that neurodivergent employees on a team bring the team closer together because of a variety of things like increased awareness and understanding and empathy of differences, but also the clearer communication that the manager, leadership, and teams tend to apply when a neurodivergent person joins their team. A large share of the employers we spoke with also indicated that neurodiversity is beneficial because of the new perspectives and ways of thinking that it brings to a team. Diverse perspectives are essential for innovation and growth. Teams that are diverse can use their unique experiences and perspectives to find creative solutions to complex problems. For example, when talking about neurodivergent employees, one employer said they can offer the ability to think about problems in unique ways and bring new perspectives to the table that then ultimately drive new ideas and innovation. Employers have also seen benefits to retention. So for example, the majority of the employers that we spoke with reported that creating a culture of inclusivity and support ultimately makes employees feel more valued and more likely to stay at the organization. When asked about the benefits of neurodiversity in the workplace, one employer responded, retention, definitely retention, really great employees that know that you're backing them up and you'll do whatever you need to do to support them. And we get that loyalty and support back from individuals. So I'd say retention is probably the biggest piece. Some of the employers that we spoke with also noted that neurodiversity training amongst leadership is beneficial because it improves the manager-employee relationship for all employees, regardless of their neurodiversity status. So for example, one employer stated, we know from research that what's inclusive to those that are neurodiverse is going to be inclusive for everyone. So we've seen education and learning opportunities for our leaders actually enhance their ability to be great leaders in general, not just for those that may be on the spectrum. So I would say that's honestly probably one of the biggest things. So overall, managers who are trained in neurodiversity are more empathetic and understanding toward employee needs. And this empathy and understanding typically extends to neurotypical workers as well. And then finally, the last benefit that I wanted to highlight, which I alluded to in the beginning of this talk, is that the majority of employers we interviewed stated that neurodiversity inclusion is beneficial because of the above average skills that many neurodivergent individuals bring to the workplace. So for example, one employer said, we're finding tremendous talent that we unconsciously were screening out versus screening in. We're finding tremendous talent. As I mentioned previously, each neurodivergent individual has their own unique set of strengths. Although, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, there is research to suggest that many neurodivergent individuals do excel in creativity, resilience, pattern recognition, memory, and mathematics. And the employers that we spoke with do agree. Okay, so given the many benefits associated with neurodiversity in the workplace, how can employers begin to break down the barriers that I previously went over and create an environment where neurodivergent workers thrive? Well, from what we've heard, it definitely has to start with awareness. When interview participants were asked about how to become more inclusive of those who are neurodivergent, the most popular response was company-wide awareness training. The concept of neurodiversity has only recently begun to gain traction in the workplace. And as I previously mentioned, this is demonstrated by more than half of our survey respondents indicating that they had only become aware of the term within the past 5 years. Those we interviewed suggest that awareness training should be company-wide and provided on an ongoing basis, so not just a one-off lunch and learn or something like that. The training should provide managers and coworkers with opportunities to dig deep into what neurodiversity is, better understand the benefits of a neurodiverse workplace, as well as the barriers that neurodivergent workers face. And importantly, it should provide opportunities for managers and coworkers to develop neuro-inclusive strategies. Research participants also highlight that this training should be delivered with those with experience in the area. So not just by your internal HR team. They recommend that companies consult with external organizations such as Specialty Sterna to provide awareness training and help with the design and implementation of neuro-inclusive policies. And it is also important to recognize that existing hiring processes and systems were not built with neurodivergent brains in mind. We heard time and time again that the traditional hiring process can be quite rigid and often does not allow those who are neurodivergent to accurately showcase their skills and demonstrate why they are a good fit for the job. We heard from many of our research participants that getting their foot in the door is the most challenging part of their career journey. So due to the biases related to the way that neurodivergent individuals may present themselves or communicate with others, we heard that neurodivergent candidates are often overlooked. And for this reason, the majority of interview participants highlighted the importance of providing alternatives to the traditional hiring process. And these can include pretty easy changes, such as providing interview questions in advance. An interview can be a very anxiety-inducing situation. And when you struggle with attention, for example, to begin with, and all of your cognitive processing is going towards minimizing your anxiety, it could be really hard then to think of clever, relevant, smart responses to questions that are just being asked to you in the moment. Having the opportunity to look over the questions with kind of a clear mind and formulate your response ahead of time could be a huge advantage to many people, including myself. Another suggestion was to provide multiple options for participating in an interview when possible. So, this could be in person, virtual, over the phone, or even via email if the job itself doesn't involve a lot of face-to-face communication. Then why not provide an opportunity for somebody to demonstrate their skills over email? Another recommendation is to avoid abstract and or behavioral questions during an interview. So questions like, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? This is an actual question that I was asked in an interview once. And I was like, I don't know many different types of trees, like evergreen, I guess, I don't know. Those types of questions can really throw off most people, but especially neurodivergent individuals, and it's not really, getting at anything relevant for the job. Job postings and interview questions should really be skills-based, focused on the hard skills that individuals need to succeed in the position. So the overall recommendation here is to write clear, skills-based job postings that avoid language such as good culture fit. So really avoiding kind of this personality, family, workplace culture type of language. The majority of interview participants also indicated that neurodivergent workers would benefit from a more open and flexible accommodation process. The number one way that employers can make the accommodation process easier for neurodivergent employees is by taking the onus off of the individual and simply being upfront about what supports are available and how they can be accessed. So a widespread practice that we noticed among the employers that we spoke with is to provide all new hires, and not just those who are neurodivergent, but all new hires with a checklist of available supports from which they can choose. So almost like a menu. And this allows for both neurodivergent and neurotypical workers to identify and access the supports they need from the very beginning. It is also important to note that many of the supports that neurodivergent workers might benefit from are low cost and easy to implement. So we heard that the most frequently requested accommodations included flexibility in terms of work location and schedule, access to a private office if required to work on site to minimize distractions, noise canceling headphones, assistive technology, soft lighting, which might sound silly, but to a lot of neurodivergent individuals, fluorescent lights can be very distracting because they do actually emit a sound that many neurodivergent individuals pick up on, and it can, really interfere with their engagement and productivity in their work. And then finally, being able to communicate via email rather than in person, when appropriate. So overall, accommodating neurodivergent individuals really frequently only involves small informal changes to how an employee performs their work. We also heard from interview participants that to be supportive of neurodivergent workers, managers should be kind, compassionate, and put people first. As I previously mentioned, fear of negative repercussions is a major barrier to disclosure. By creating a trusting employee-manager relationship, neurodivergent workers may feel more comfortable talking openly about their neurodiversity status and accessing the supports that they need. There are many steps that managers can take to put people first and improve the workplace experience for both neurodivergent and neurotypical employees. So these include, offering regular check-ins that allow employees to express their thoughts, concerns, and need for support, being flexible and allowing employees to work from home if applicable, or take time off when needed, of course, celebrating successes such as promotions or a job well done. So taking those opportunities to not only focus on deadlines and constructive feedback, but also celebrating, the positive outcomes in a job well done. Providing a reasonable workload and ensuring that employees don't burn out. And then importantly, advocating on behalf of their employee in terms of accessing supports, promotions, and other workplace opportunities. Feeling like your manager has your back, I think, is a really important part of the employee-manager relationship. And you'll see here that these are just kind of good management practices in general. They can be particularly helpful for those who are neurodivergent in terms of forming a trusting relationship and feeling like they can bring their true selves to the workplace. But of course, these types of management practices are, of course, beneficial for everybody. New parents who might need some flexibility in terms of taking care of their kids, or kids seem to, the people I work with who have young kids seem to constantly be sick. So that kind of flexibility is really important for many different types of people in the workplace, but can be particularly beneficial to those who are neurodivergent. Okay, and then finally, so the last recommendation I'm going to provide today in this presentation is that we heard from neurodivergent workers that being neurodivergent in the workplace can feel isolating, and that they would benefit from having a sense of community with whom they can openly share their struggles and seek advice and support. So one relatively straightforward way to create a stronger sense of community is to provide the space for employees to create an employee research group that focuses on the experience of being neurodivergent in the workplace. ERGs are an important part of any DEI initiative, as they allow employees to advocate for themselves and can help them feel more confident and engaged in their work. So creating a space and opportunities for employees to create their own sense of community in the workplace is a great step toward becoming more neuro-inclusive. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. In terms of our plan for disseminating this research, as I mentioned, we've published an issue briefing that has been or will be shared with you. And we're currently in the process of writing a longer report and executive summary that essentially captures everything that I discussed today, but just in a bit more detail. So do keep an eye out for that. I will share it with the conference organizers, and hopefully they'll be able to get it into your hands. And we're hoping for that to be released around the end of February or beginning of March. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this session, and hopefully, you learned a little bit more about neurodiversity, and I would love to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Jane, for being with us today and going through what a wonderful presentation and touching on so many different aspects. Our question and answer is already popping, which is wonderful, with lots of questions coming in, but I'll just take a quick second to remind everyone, as questions might be coming to your mind or you're starting to type right now, that question and answer in the menu bar at the most likely bottom of your screen is where you can communicate with us today. Okay, so to start things off, the first question is around generational differences. So what is the rate of neurodiversity amongst different generations, or the surveyed rate? I realize that awareness may be different across generations.
Great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know like the specific statistics. But what I will say, though, is that if you've spent, any time on TikTok or Instagram these past few months, you might have noticed that there's a lot more focus on, ADHD and autism, and how these conditions have been quite misunderstood over time. Growing up, I grew up in the 1990s or early 2000s. There really didn't seem to be a very in-depth understanding of what ADHD is. I think when a lot of people think about ADHD, and especially in that time, what people were thinking about was hyperactive boys who couldn't sit still in class and were troublesome for their teachers. This is one reason for why I think women have gone so undiagnosed over the years. It just manifests differently. It can manifest in, anxiety, perfectionism. A lot of individuals with ADHD do very well in school. So people just assumed, if you're not doing well in school, you don't have ADHD. Or if you are doing well in school, how could you have ADHD? So I don't know if there's different prevalence rates in terms of the conditions across generations, but I do think there's more understanding and acceptance within younger generations than older generations currently. That's just my perspective on that.
Well, thank you for that. And I think some of those examples we may have all had to question ourselves or things as we've learned more about this topic. So the next question is going into performance reviews. That's something that's a fairly typical practice amongst employers. So looking for potential thoughts or recommendations that may have come from this research or experience or other projects you're involved in around what supports or accommodations, modifications, all of those wonderful things would you suggest for conducting annual performance reviews with neurodivergent employees?
Great question. So this is where providing recommendations can get very tricky, because I do want to emphasize again that neurodivergent individuals are all different. It's not there's no one right way of doing performance reviews for neurodivergent or autistic individuals. I would say that perhaps the best approach here would be to, ask your employees, and not just the one neurodivergent person, but maybe ask your employees how they best receive feedback. Make that like a team thing, so that you're not singling out the neurodivergent employee, so that you can ensure that you're providing feedback to them in the most helpful and constructive way. I'm sorry if that's not a very specific recommendation. I'm not too sure like what the specific issues you've experienced in doing, annual performance reviews with neurodivergent individuals have been. But my kind of general recommendation is to, be flexible and kind of personalize your interactions with your employees depending on how they best, receive feedback, which I do acknowledge can be, a lot of work. But so that's my suggestion there.
Well, I think it also ties back to what you also mentioned around this people first management, right? And kind of individualistic approaches. There is a slight bit of context. I don't know if it would change your answer at all, because there was a bracket around particularly autism spectrum being the neurodivergent. So if that adds anything to your answer, or we can move to the next.
I don't think it adds anything to my answer. Just like, all neurodivergent employees, all autistic individuals are different and require different amounts of support. I think, just creating this kind of inclusive policy of, reaching out to all of your employees, asking them how they best receive feedback and would best like to communicate with you about performance reviews. Because I do understand that that's an important part of being a manager. Is the best way forward. And again, I would encourage you not to single out the neurodivergent individual, because that could, your intentions might be good, but they then might feel, isolated or different from their peers. So just kind of making it that overall inclusive practice of just asking, how they would like the annual performance review to go. So that's my recommendation there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that's one of the themes I've personally picked up on throughout the presentation of where, it's not just that it's benefiting neurodivergent, but kind of that concept of universal design, right? Where there is benefit to all and kind of making these just standard practices as opposed to feeling or making them feel like accommodations.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so the next one, we'll start off with a wonderful compliment to you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. And then curious around the participant demographic a little bit. So were these from across sectors, private, not-for-profit, public, all of those things, just to get a sense of, was this kind of a diverse in sector, or were the participants more segmented?
Yeah, great question. And hello to Wanda. I do know Wanda. We participated on a prior panel together on neurodiversity. So it's
wonderful.
Nice to, I can't see you, Wanda, but it's nice to see your name and interact with you. So participants were from different sectors. So we spoke with, a lot of people in the public service. I think our emails often go out to people in the public service, and they tend to respond quite frequently to our requests to participate in research, but also private and nonprofit. So we did have a mix of people from different sectors and industries. I can't recall off the top of my head, in the report that we have coming out, we do have a breakdown of industry, I do believe, or I could be thinking of another report. But I actually do think I'm thinking of another report. But the answer to your question is they were from more than one sector, across private, nonprofit, public.
Okay, wonderful. There is another question around from the personal experience that you shared within this presentation, and wondering if your approach to the workplace has changed at all since you've discovered this diagnosis for yourself.
Yeah, I love that question. It's a great question. So I would say it has. Well, so my job at the Conference Board, I started a little over a year, or a bit like a year and a few months ago. So I started in October of last year, and or the prior year. And I work remotely. I love working remotely. That's just how our workplace is set up. It really works well with me and managing my personal ADHD symptoms. It allows me to work in the comfort of my own home. It allows me to take breaks when I need to. It allows me to, exercise in the middle of the day, which is something that I've found is really helpful for my cognitive functioning is exercise. I will also say that it's really the supports that individuals need with ADHD and other forms of neurodivergent are very personalized. Medication really seems to do the trick for me. I don't need much support from my manager beyond that. But since starting medication and kind of living a more healthy lifestyle that my remote job allows me to do, I found that the biggest change for me is I still struggle with like procrastination and starting tasks. That I think will always be a bit of a struggle for me, but it has changed my confidence and how I feel like emotionally around work. It feels a lot less stressful and anxiety inducing. I'm also just much more aware of boundaries in the workplace and how important that is for everybody, but especially neurodivergent individuals. When I was in grad school, I didn't set many boundaries. I kind of made, work my life, and that was the most important thing. A big thing with ADHD that I recently learned is hyperfixation. That kind of goes against, I think, the general stereotype of ADHD. Hyperfixation occurs in ADHD individuals when they're working on a task and that's just all they can do. Yeah, I certainly experienced that while working on my dissertation. I would just work on it. I couldn't, my partner would like ask me a question and I just wouldn't answer, or I would, forget to eat lunch. So that type of hyperfixation I found I can avoid if I'm really conscious about setting up workplace boundaries and, just having more of a work-life balance, which goes back to the workplace providing an environment that would allow me to do so. I work at a company that is very supportive of work-life balance and offers me the opportunity to work remotely with a flexible schedule. So it's really a combination of, it's really the environment in combination with my medication that has really allowed me to change how I perceive my work and my productivity in the workplace. I don't know if that really answered your question. That's just my kind of personal experience with how my perspectives have changed.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I want to, again, thank you for sharing lived experience and the vulnerability of that. So appreciate so much that bringing that perspective into this conversation as well. So this is a little bit more resource specific. So again, if there is links or things, feel free and we can pass them forward. But any recommended learning courses that you may be aware of or through your project work aware of for employers to take around educating themselves, but also improving the accommodations for neurodivergent employees in the workplace?
Great question. So nothing specific that's coming to me at the moment. I do know, so there's various organizations, not very many, but there are a few that are focused. There's many more in the States, I actually realized, but within Canada, there aren't all too many organizations that focus specifically on the workplace experiences of neurodivergent individuals, but there are a few. So especially Sterna, that I previously mentioned, I'll spell it out in the chat here. They are primarily a company that helps, there we go. They're primarily a company that helps neurodivergent individuals secure employment, and they also partner with organizations to recruit neurodivergent talent. But they also do have awareness training that they provide. So they could be an organization to reach out to provide that type of awareness training. There's also orbital learning. Let me type that out too. Sorry, 1 second. I'm not very good at
Wonderful. No, thank you so much for taking that time.
Orbital learning. They are an organization in BC. They're located in BC, I believe, and they, similarly to especially Sterna, they do provide those recruitment services, but they do also have an aspect of their company that's focused specifically on educating employers. I would look into them to see what they offer in terms of educating employers and raising awareness.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I'll just do a little small follow-up question to that as well.
Sure.
In terms of recommendations, because we've talked so much around the individualistic experience and how there is so much individualism within. So just maybe to talk a little bit about how to, within training, balance wanting obviously that overall awareness, but keeping that individualism in there, that not every experience is going to be the same. Are there things that you should look out for in terms of the training and messaging that happens through that?
Sure. So I think that's a massive part of the training is being aware of the individualistic nature of neurodiversity. In my opinion, universal design and flexibility is the name of the game. When I first started out on this project, I found it really hard to think of, how are we going to provide recommendations to people because it's so personalized and it's so unique. But then I realized that, a lot of workplaces aren't even, offering this type of flexibility and don't even have that understanding that people approach work in different ways, regardless of whether you're neurodivergent or not. For a long time, there's just been kind of this misconception that, everybody's just expected to fit themselves into workplace processes in the way that they are designed. And if you can't do that, then there's something wrong with you. I think we've found in the pandemic that there's many alternative approaches to working, and that these alternative approaches can be, very inclusive. I don't think that we should be, going back. I do think that, we should kind of build on this momentum and better understand how we continue to create workplaces that really take personal barriers and ways of working into consideration. And again, with that universal design piece, I've heard that some companies have started doing during the onboarding process, having every employee just kind of fill out, how do you enjoy working? How do you receive feedback best? Just trying to gauge those individual differences at the very early stages. I recognize that that's challenging, taking into consideration every single person's preferences and ways of working. I don't, it might not be realistic for every single workplace, but I do think, especially knowledge workers who work in this environment where we're working at our computers, providing opportunities to provide flexible and ways to do that is really important. So that would be my response to that.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much for that addition. And we do have a few more questions, so I'm going to power through here. This is looking for also some shared lived experience. So one of our participants is asking a recommendation for someone who is a disability management practitioner and identifies as neurodivergent with ADD/ADHD, and how can you leverage your neurodiversity to our advantage? So wondering if there's anything you'd like to share on that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and I love that from a recently ADD diagnosed woman who grew up in the 90s, early 2000s. So there's a lot of us. Do I have any recommendations for disability management? I don't. I'm sorry. I don't have any specific I don't know of anyone who, is in that position and also identifies as ADD. So I don't really have any recommendations for you there. I have recommendations, if you wanted to follow up with me offline, let me actually put my email in the chat. If you want to follow up with me via email, just to discuss, ADHD, more broadly and, supports in the workplace, we can definitely have a conversation, and I can, point you to some resources that have helped me personally.
Wonderful. Is there anything on the secondary question around using neurodiversity to your advantage? Anything that came out whether in the interviews, research, or personal experience there?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, neurodivergent individuals do have an advantage because your brain, works differently than the norm, and that's always, a massive advantage in the workplace. If you can see problems differently, come up with new creative solutions, even interacting with people differently, that's a huge advantage. So I'm not sure if you're asking like how to make that advantage clearer to like employers, for example, but this type of question came up in a prior talk that I gave, and somebody asked, I don't know if this is sitting on your question or not, but it might be relevant. Somebody asked, like, I don't want to share with my employer that I have ADD or ADHD, but I do want them to know, like, about the challenges and, about why neurodiversity is beneficial. So my suggestion was just to share resources with your manager. And you don't have to say, I'm sharing these because I'm neurodivergent, but just because you're interested in, workplace inclusivity and you think it's important for them to know. Like my team, for example, we have a Teams chat that we just, I'll share pictures of my dog frequently, like that kind of stuff.
Right.
So that would be like a good place to be like, hey team, like I was reading about neurodiversity. It's a hot topic in the workplace. Thought I would share some resources if anyone wants to learn more. So that's an approach of kind of educating or having your manager or employer kind of think more about these issues. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, wonderful. A quick question, I think, from, again, your professional and possible personal experiences. Do you see value in ADHD coaches? They received a bit of mixed reviews, whether social workers may be better suited or this kind of coach might be a good option as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know much about this, I'll be perfectly honest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. This is kind of a personal thing, I think. It depends on the kind of
Personal
support
experience.
it depends on the kind of
Mm-hmm.
support you're looking for. If you're really looking for, you know, you with ADHD, for example, and you're thinking, look, I'm really struggling with procrastination and starting tasks. There's no real like supports that my manager can provide me to help with those issues. Maybe working through those types of issues with an ADHD coach or a social worker could be beneficial. I don't know. I haven't done that myself. The way we framed this research and this project was to kind of steer away from approaches that put the onus on the individual and more focus on how employers can break down barriers that they might not even know exist in the workplace for neurodivergent individuals. That's not to say that, taking initiative and figuring out what's helpful for you and reaching out to counselors, social workers, ADHD coaches, that could be very beneficial for, individuals with ADHD. It's not a recommendation that we provide in our research, again, just because our focus really is on providing recommendations to employers. But I think that's really just kind of, it depends on, the type of support that you're looking for. And if you feel you can't really get it in the workplace and you would benefit from speaking with a clinician, then, that's probably a good idea.
Thank you so much. I do want to be mindful of time. We're a couple of minutes over the hour. We have 2 questions left that have come through. If you're willing to spend a couple more minutes with us, or we can see if we can provide the answers in the post communications that we have.
I'm happy.
Okay.
I'm happy. Yeah, no worries.
Okay, perfect. So one question we have coming through the chat here is supporting neurodivergence part of the psychological health and wellness responsibilities of employers? I guess at the end of the day, is this really a part of an employer responsibility to ensure that neurodivergent workers have that psychological health and wellness? I have an assumption, but you can take it over.
So I'm trying to find the question.
It came through in a different way, but I can try and send it to you.
Yeah. So, I would describe what I'm talking about, not like suggesting that employers provide like psychological help to their employees. It's more really just an understanding that there are people whose brains, by no fault of their own, operate differently than the average person. And workplaces, the typical workplace environment where you go into an office 9 to 5, sit in a cubicle, work on your work tasks. That's all you should be working on. You better not step out to go for a run or something. Those types of workplace environments are just really not conducive to allowing people whose brains think differently to do their best work and to engage in their work and to feel motivated and confident. So I would say it's not the employer's responsibility to, provide psychological, well, it is a responsibility to, provide benefits to people so that they can access these services if they want them. But I would say it is their responsibility to create workplaces that work for most people or everyone and not just, a very narrow group of people. So I do think that is a responsibility that falls on the employer, and it also benefits the employer. So I'm not saying that employers should be doing this out of the goodness of their own hearts, because I recognize that workplaces don't always work like that. And that's why, we also want to focus on the benefits of why companies should be doing this. You're going to improve company culture. Your employees are going to be happier. If your employees are happier, they're going to be more likely to stay in your organization. You're training managers to be more empathetic and understanding. So employees are going to relate more to their managers. Again, that makes them happier and more likely to stay in your organization. So it really is, if we want to take out the morality aspect of it, it is also a really good retention tool. And it's also very helpful for allowing people to have diverse perspectives and opinions in the workplace. Can be incredibly helpful for innovation and growth, which this point in time is very important for companies. We're at a point in time where digitalization is happening so quickly. We're trying to make workplaces more sustainable and fighting against impacts of climate change. So we're in a point in the workplace, I feel, that we really want these creative, innovative people to help solve these really tough challenges and bring us into the future of work. Relying on old methods and old, ways of working and rigid environments is not going to get us there, in my personal opinion. So overall, not the employer's responsibility to suggest that individuals go out and get psychological help, but it is their responsibility and to their benefit to create workplace environments that are flexible and accommodating and supportive of a bunch of different types of people and thinkers. So that's
Absolutely. And the kind of culture of inclusion that you spoke to as well. And I'll just bring forward, we have a participant as well that is bringing forward that aspect of the duty to accommodate is actually built into legislation. So certainly that's a part of the conversation potentially as well. Yeah, so
and
absolutely.
I think I would just add to that like employers, I think, see this duty to accommodate as a burden. I don't think it has to be a burden. Yes. As I mentioned, a lot of these accommodations that neurodivergent individuals benefit from are really just small changes to how they perform their everyday work that go against the norm. Like working from home was like unheard of almost before the pandemic. And now it's a huge support to a lot of people who are neurodivergent. And as I was mentioning, a lot of other people. So, and I do see that I just realized that all of my chats were only going to hosts and panels.
I've already put it to everyone, so not to worry. We've taken care of it. No problems there.
Thank you.
And yes, absolutely would love to echo that accommodations and those kinds of things that seem daunting. The research certainly and the numbers back up that there's a lot that are actually no cost at all, like you said, these kind of small working areas, or very very small costs when it comes to maybe a little bit a different headset than others or things like that. So so certainly want to echo that from some of the resources we've done as well. Okay, so just to be mindful of everyone's time, we'll end with this final question, and I'll thank the audience right off the top for being such a lively discussion today. We love to see this kind of engagement. So do you find that perhaps through unconscious bias or misinformation, employers could potentially unconsciously change their perception of a neurodivergent employee's skills and abilities to progress professionally, so that perhaps that's after a disclosure or something like that, and that unconscious bias kind of comes into play?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I see this question. I just want to read it.
Absolutely.
Okay, do you find it perhaps especially naturally change? So I'm not 100% sure what you're asking, but how I read that question was, do I think implicit bias influences how employers see neurodivergent workers? And I would say 100% yes, absolutely. I think that if you have kind of this misunderstanding of neurodiversity and also, disability, I'm not saying that being neurodivergent is a disability. Some neurodivergent individuals do use the disability term, others don't. But essentially, I would say that if you don't have an understanding of what that looks like in the workplace and how it can be supported, or, for example, I'll use the example of ADHD because it's what I'm most familiar with. If your understanding of ADHD is that ADHD workers, procrastinate, which is true, and, have a hard time staying on top of their work, you just perceive people with ADHD as like bad workers because that's what your knowledge of ADHD is, and you're not aware of the benefits like creativity, new ways of thinking. When you're supported properly in the right work environment, then absolutely you're going to overlook, that individual with ADHD rather than, you'd be like, well, why don't I just hire someone who doesn't have ADHD? So if you're not aware of neurodiversity and how it can be supported and how it can be beneficial, then I do absolutely think that any, unconscious biases you have can certainly influence whether you choose to hire someone who's neurodivergent or not. And I think it's important to know that you're not always going to know that someone is neurodivergent. So, most people of course, if you want to disclose before an interview, for example, you should. A lot of job postings say if you require accommodations, make sure to reach out to us. But a lot of people don't do that. So I think, employers and hiring managers need to have an understanding that not everybody you're interviewing, many people you're interviewing are going to be neurodivergent, whether they explicitly know that or not, but just being aware that people might present differently in an interview setting. And that's okay, kind of looking past over people who might be a little socially awkward or, not making eye contact, rather than letting that kind of distort your opinion of the applicant or the employee, just really, focusing on, well, what can they do? They have great experience, they have great skills, they can be a huge asset to the workplace. Someone who's not knowledgeable about neurodiversity might just kind of be like, oh, that person kind of gave me, like a weird vibe. They're not going to fit in with our team culture. I'm just like not even going to follow up. And one of the quotes from our research actually was someone saying, before we had this understanding of neurodiversity, we were just screening talent out. because of those reasons.
Right, right.
Rather than screening talent in. So that was a long-winded response to the question. I don't even remember the question, but I hope that was helpful.
No, thank you so much. And I absolutely think that it answered the question and all of the questions that we've had today. Thank you for your thoughtfulness and well thought out answers. I really appreciate it, and bringing such highlight and awareness to a topic that I think does require this kind of conversation and knowledge building. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for spending some extra time today, both yourself and our audience. And I'll just take 30 more seconds of your time to wrap up. Once again, to our Work Wellness Institute members, you will receive your free certificate of attendance. And if you're interested in membership with the Work Wellness Institute, please go to our workwellnessinstitute.org website and go to the kind of join us members section, or you can directly email membership services at workwellnessinstitute.org to learn more. I hope that we'll see you again in other educational resources that we have on offer. Please feel free again to go to the website and go to our courses and resources section. And we do have our next webinar on March 8th, also at 10 o'clock for those in the Pacific time zone, on highly educated immigrant workers' perspectives of occupational health and safety in work conditions that challenge the workplace safety. Also, again, there will be an evaluation survey. We really hope that you'll take just a couple minutes of your time to fill that in. You may be directed to it when we end our session today. It may come up as a third-party link, but please continue clicking through to get to it. It'll just take a couple minutes of your time, and we really do use that valuable feedback to ensure the relevancy and timeliness of our resources for our audience. And our resources are created for public access. So again, please look to that courses and resources section of our website to explore our eCampus and all of the different knowledge mobilization resources we have on offer. Thank you again so much, Jane, for your wonderful presentation, expertise, thoughts, experience, everything that you brought to today's session, and to our audience for joining with us today.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day,
Feel
everyone.
free to
We'll see you soon.
follow up with me on email as well.
Thank you so much, Jane. We have it in the chat, but we'll be sure to include that in post communications as well, along with the presentation materials.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.